Good afternoon, and welcome to what I'm confident will be an entertaining and enlightening discussion and a unique opportunity to examine a defining and quickly evolving national security topic. I'm Captain Scott Craverath, the commanding officer of the Vanderbilt Naval Officer Training Unit, and on behalf of the university, who supports our military staff and students spectacularly, and our Naval ROTC Alumni Association, whose work and support of our battalion has and continues to be instrumental in the health, well-being, and education of our midshipmen, and whose support for this, our National Security Symposium, now in its 7th year, is a unique event among ROTC programs. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This speaker series has proven a remarkable success, tackling complicated and important issues, and is directly in keeping with our mandate as an ROTC program to not only further the mission to educate and commission future Navy, Marine Corps, and Army officers, but also to link and engage our military with our university and our community, in this case through enlightened examination and discussion of national security matters. I would also like to welcome this afternoon the distinguished military and faculty members and supporters of our military and of our unit, from the Military Officers Association, Navy and Marine Corps Leagues, American Legion, DAR, Operation Stand Down, and so many others that support us, our local military, and our veterans. We consider all of you partners with us. I also need to acknowledge our NROTC Alumni Association President, Mr. Frank Walter, and our Chairman, Rear Admiral Jerry Brest, for the continuing hard work on our behalf. Also, recent additions to our board include retired Vice Admiral Bill French, who recently retired from Commander Navy Installations Command, and Vice Admiral Kendall Card, the former Director of Naval Intelligence, who we have asked to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon, as well as facilitate questions later on. I first met Admiral Card when we were both stationed in Colorado Springs. Then as now, he has always been willing to give of his time and effort to support events, commemorations, and things like this. He has become a true friend and asset to our program. The Admiral earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Vanderbilt and also holds a Master's degree in National Security and Strategic Studies from the U.S. Navy War College. He's also a graduate of the U.S. Navy Test Pilot School and former commanding officer of the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, and one of 4 flag officers that Vanderbilt has produced in the last generation. Now with Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Admiral Card is the Director, Department of Defense Programs, Global Security Directorate, where he oversees programs and research performed for the Defense Department. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Vice Admiral Kendall Card.
Thanks so much for that warm welcome, Scott. It's wonderful to be back here at my alma mater to introduce, and it is a great honor, by the way, to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, who is the commander of the Air Force Space Command, General John Hyten. If you hadn't read his bio yet, please do take an opportunity to do it. And you'll see that since he graduated from Harvard on an Air Force ROTC scholarship, he's achieved an absolutely remarkable level of leadership and record, just like you would expect from a 4-star serving today. In terms of education, after he left Harvard, he achieved MBA from Auburn University in 1985. He was a distinguished graduate of the Air Command and Staff College in 1994. He was a National Defense Fellow at the University of Illinois in 1999. And in 2011, he completed the Senior Manager in Government course at Harvard, and that's where we, in the military, send our very best and brightest. Like every 4-star, as you would expect, he's commanded at every level. He was the commander of the 6th Space Operations Squadron in Offutt, Nebraska. He commanded the 595th Space Group at Schriever Air Force Base, and also commanded the 50th Space Wing. And as a general officer, you can see he's devoted almost the last 7-8 years in space and cyberspace. Director of Requirements at the headquarters, U.S. Air Force Space Command. Director of Cyber and Space Operations at the Air Force headquarters. Worked for the Undersecretary of Air Force as the Director of Space Acquisition and the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force as the Director of Space Requirements. Following that, he was the Vice Commander of his current command and now the Commander of Air Force Space Command, which you'll read in his bio, is responsible for 38,000 people globally, 134 locations across the globe. In short, he's responsible for all things space and cyber, including manning, equipping, training, acquiring, and operating space systems. Quite a portfolio and quite a responsibility. On top of being a great officer, he's also a great gentleman. I had the privilege of meeting General Hyten at Capstone, which is where all the one-stars of the services get together, newly promoted flags and general officers, to learn about each other, join operations, and start that next, the third pinnacle, I would say, in your career. And at Capstone, they tell you there's typically 50 or so general and flag officers, and they tell you that, hey, about 25 of you are going to make 2-star, about a handful of you guys are going to make 3-star, and there's going to be 1 or 2 of you that are going to be a 4-star someday. And I can tell you that it's no surprise to me, or if you called the other 48 members of my class, that John Hyten is sitting here today as a 4-star. He was that good then, and he's that good now. And it really is my pleasure to introduce somebody who's been a standout leader and a standout person his whole career. And then, according to Google, he's also the pride and joy of Huntsville, Alabama, where he and Laura will head tonight, I believe. So, ladies and gentlemen, my honor and pleasure, General John E. Hyten.
So let's see. Yes, the mic is working. That's a good start. Thank you very much for the introduction, Kendall. Scott, thank you to all the midshipmen cadets and for you for making today such a wonderful day. You know, Vanderbilt's a pretty special place. It really is. We got to spend some time today in a couple of very interesting institutes and labs talking to some folks. But the best time of the day by far was talking to a handful of midshipmen and cadets at lunch. Because as you look, you know, number one, I'm old and they're not. And to see the interest and enthusiasm they have about life, the curiosity they have for the future, the questions they asked me at lunch, it really was the highlight of the week, not just the highlight of the day, maybe the highlight of the year. Anytime you get a chance to talk to young people that are just starting out, that are finding their way and figuring out what they're going to do next, it's always a great thing because there's tremendous excitement ahead. As Admiral Card said, I have 36,000 men and women in Air Force Base Command, 36,000 airmen stationed today 134 places around the world. 134 places at basically as far north as Thule Air Base, Greenland, as far south as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And we do some remarkable things, and we do things that a lot of people don't even realize. One of the things that we get to do is we get to fundamentally change how the nation fights and wins the wars that we're in today. Because before we had space and cyberspace, it was a different world. Before we used space and cyberspace in the military domain, it was a fundamentally different world. It used to be you'd look at space as a national pride issue, but space really is a national security issue now. And cyberspace is a completely new challenge. And a lot of people ask me, why are space and cyberspace in the same command? It's only in the Air Force that space and cyberspace are in the same command. Why did they put space and cyberspace in the same command? And if you think about it, it's really easy to explain. Because what do we do in space today for the military? We provide information, we provide pathways for information, and we try to deny adversaries access to that information in times of conflict. That's what we do in space. What are our missions in cyberspace? Provide information, pathways for information, to deny an adversary that information when we go forward. So information kind of becomes the key. So go ahead and put up the first chart. So this chart, you probably look at that chart and you say, what are you trying to say with that chart? That's about as different a chart as you could get. Three different episodes in history. The first thing you ought to know about the three items in that chart are that they all took place this week in history. One in 1944, one in 62, one in 83. All took place at this week in history. The one on the left is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Hopefully the midshipmen in this room know what the heck I'm talking about when I talk about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It's probably maybe the seminal naval battle in the history of warfare, maybe the largest naval battle that ever took place. It took place this week, 1944. A 5-day battle between the Allied forces, primarily American and Australian, and the Japanese forces. There was about almost 300 ships involved on the Allied side and less than 100 ships on the Japanese side. The interesting thing about that battle, though, was that battle hinged on information. That battle hinged on who knew what, when. It hinged on 2 episodes of trying to provide misinformation to the adversaries, one by the Japanese, one by the American. The Americans left the most critical piece of terrain in that battlefield completely unguarded, and the Japanese came through it one night, all because of miscommunication, lack of information about where the enemy was. The American admiral in charge, Admiral Bull Halsey, believed that the Japanese central force was in one place. They were actually in another place. As they were fighting through that misinformation, nonetheless, at the end of the game, even though historians love to go back and say Halsey screwed up here and Halsey screwed up there and he should never have left the straits, he should have done this, he should have done that, fundamentally, that was the battle that changed the Pacific. And it changed the Pacific episode in World War II forever, because after that battle, there was no Japanese Navy, because the Japanese Navy was basically destroyed. The Japanese naval leadership looked at the Japanese fleet as a support fleet from that moment on, no more a tactical fleet. But it all hinged on information and the confusion that was there. It's also interesting, if you're a history buff, to look back, and you look back at what other people say the largest battle in the history of naval warfare was, and you have to go back to the Peloponnesian War and Salamis, right off of the coast of Greece, between the Greeks and the Persians. And the Greeks in that case had 300 ships, and the Persians had 1,200 ships. And it's interesting because that battle hinged on a critical piece of information. Because the critical piece of information is the Greeks, the smaller force, wanted the Persians to come into very tight quarters in the straits. And if they felt if they could get in those very tight quarters, those 1,200 ships would no longer be able to maneuver, and they would have the right angles of attack, the right ability to destroy the fleet. And fundamentally, that's how the Greeks end up winning the Peloponnesian War. That was the turning point in history. And again, that turning point in history hinged on information. Information on one side, misinformation provided to an enemy to deceive them, and then lack of information on the other side. And then you look at the middle, 1962. President Kennedy talking to the world, not just the American people, talking to the world over television, and basically announcing the blockade of Cuba and showing intelligence pictures to the world about what was going on in Cuba with nuclear missiles on the Cuban soil that were coming after the United States. A fundamental change, because until that time, information was limited to very small numbers of people. Information was limited to where you were going to provide that information, who knew what to where. It was limited to the information you saw in Leyte Gulf, and information you saw in the Peloponnesian War. All through those centuries, that's kind of the way information was. And then in 1962, without the diplomatic side of the house, really, President Kennedy got on television. National television is what it was called, but it was really television to the world, and told the Soviet Union that we knew what they were doing in Cuba, showed them that what we were doing in Cuba, announced a blockade, and fundamentally changed the entire course of history by making Khrushchev ultimately back down. All because of a different information power that the United States chose to employ at that singular time. The next piece on the right, that's Beirut in 1983. That's Khobar Towers. That's the beginning, in many historians, in my view, of the war on terrorism. And what did our adversaries figure out in 1983? They figured out that the best way to take on the United States of America was not directly. It's not the picture on the left. The best way to take on the United States of America is asymmetrically, because if you create a singular event, the information age will broadcast that event to everybody in the world, and everybody in the world will see it, and you will create terror and panic and structure. And so our adversaries figured out how to use information. So when you think about what space and cyber fundamentally do for our military, it's all about information. It's all about how do we control information. And our adversaries watched us since 1983. Since 1983, then it rolled into Panama in 1989. It rolled into the first Gulf War, Desert Shield in 90, Desert Storm in 91. It rolled into Enduring Freedom in 2001, Iraqi Freedom in 2003, into the conflicts we are today. They watched what the United States did with information, and they basically realized that we use space and cyberspace to completely change warfare. No longer was it force on force. It was us knowing exactly where the adversary was at any time and be able to take action at our choosing based on our political will and our desire to do something anytime we wanted to. And there wasn't anything anybody could do about it. The only limitation on our actions was ourselves. We would hold back for collateral damage. We would hold back for the situation that was there, but we never held back because of an enemy action. It fundamentally changed how we looked at warfare. So information became the key. So go to the next chart. So agile information superiority. So if you've looked at history of military operations over the last 20 years, information superiority became a buzzword. It became a buzzword that every service used. We have to gain and maintain information superiority the same way we gain and maintain air superiority, and superiority in the maritime domain, superiority on the land, superiority everywhere we operate. We have to gain and maintain superiority in that domain. And information became another buzzword of that. Information superiority, though, in many ways became a given in how we look at how we operate. Just like air superiority, it is not a given. It is a very, very difficult thing to maintain if you have an adversary that is determined to take that away from you. Because both in space and cyberspace, because of the way we grew up, we have built significant vulnerabilities into our space and cyberspace systems. And so if you grow up without a threat, if you grow up in the space world for the last almost 30 years, basically since the Soviet Union fell, if you look at the way we've done business the last 30 years, fundamentally, we had a peaceful, benign environment in space to deal with, where we could basically do whatever we wanted to in space and nobody would challenge us. And so in that time, think about what was created. GPS, the Global Positioning System, which probably is in 80% of the people's cars in this room, some kind of GPS receiver. Probably 80% of the people in this room have a phone on them right now that has a GPS receiver in them. When we started down this path, none of that even existed. When we went into the first Gulf War, which many people call the first space war, we didn't even have a partially populated GPS constellation. We achieved initial operational capability shortly after the war. We had periods where we'd use GPS in the first Gulf War, but that was for very specific purposes, very specific times, because there was times of the day where there were no GPS satellites overhead. That was in 1991. Now GPS is everywhere in what we do, not just the navigation signal, but the timing signal. The timing signal is embedded in pretty much every traffic light in this town, every ATM in this town, every bank in this town, every financial transaction you use. Anytime you go to the gas station and get gas out, that gas card that you use or that credit card that you use will not work without GPS. All of that has changed in this very short period of time where we moved into dealing with a benign environment. Same thing with our missile warning systems. We first built our missile warning systems in the early 1960s to warn us against potential nuclear threats. But since then, we've had Scuds, we've had short-range missiles, we've had missiles that are a threat to our forces. We've had a number of different things, and we fielded an entire different architecture called the Space-Based Infrared System that fundamentally does space and gives us warning of any missile activity on the Earth, anywhere in a blink of an eye. It's a truly remarkable capability. And communications. Communications, we had very limited space-based communications when we went into the first Gulf War. Most of our communication was still radio. Admiral Card at the time was still operating mostly on radios. Most of our aircraft were still UHF radio-based systems, but we had started building satellite communications. But since that time, we've built a fleet of wideband communication satellite, a fleet of narrowband satellites operated by the Navy, a fleet of protected satellite communication systems that can operate through any environment, including the nuclear environment, and we've put those in place, again, assuming a benign environment. And then we've used those in every conflict that I've mentioned. And in those conflicts, we've had information superiority. We knew exactly, if we had a pilot that went down someplace, if we had a pilot that was shot down, a pilot that crashed someplace in the theater, they would crash in the middle of Iraq, and we would know exactly where they were, and we'd be talking to them before the adversary had any clue that there was even a pilot down. That's how fast it became. Information superiority was embedded in everything that we did, but it was not agile. It was anything but agile. It was fixed, and it was based on the assumption that it would always be there. But it won't always be there. So how do you build agility into a system that is built to be anything but agile? That's the challenge we have as we look forward, because I don't want to go back to how we fought in Vietnam. I first put on the uniform in 1977, 2 years after Saigon. Any cadet or midshipman in this room born in 1977? Nope, not a one. So you think about it. 1977 is when I first came in. So all of the people that taught me about what it took to be an airman came out of Vietnam. Most of the people that taught Admiral Card how to be an ensign came out of Vietnam. They fought in a certain way in Vietnam. Now when I teach my airmen how they're going to fight this next generation of conflicts that we're going to be in, and sadly we're going to be in conflict for a long time around the world, I teach very little about how we fought in Vietnam. It's almost like that period didn't exist in terms of tactics and strategy. It's just fundamentally different today. But if we don't build agility in the information superiority piece, we'll be back to fighting the way we did in Vietnam. And it's not that we don't know how to do that, because I know how to do that. I know how to teach my airmen how to do that. I think everybody that has served long enough understands how to do that, but it is ugly, it's nasty, it requires significant risk of life, limb, and property. It requires an assumption of huge collateral damage in a territory where we have made a decision as a nation we don't want to employ collateral damage anymore. If we don't have agility in our information superiority piece, that's the kind of conflict we're going to go back to. And I never want to go back there, and I don't think anybody here should ever want to go back there. Therefore, we have to figure out how to fight this way. It is fundamentally different. Next chart. So, if you've been involved in military briefings at any time in your life, you've seen a chart like this. And the unique thing about the chart like this is that we have all these lines that kind of go back and forth between all the things on the chart. You have ones and zeros that are flying through that. Why do we do that? You know why we do that? Because we have no other way to show it. We have no other way to show how everything is linked together. So many people that I grew up with in the Air Force believed that the Air Force was the only service that really mattered. And I've talked to many people who are in the Army back in the 60s and 70s, and they believe the Army only really mattered. If you talk to the Marine Corps, it's the only thing the Marine Corps, that's all that matters. You know, if you talk to a space guy, for my first 25 years in the space business, space was all that mattered. We were doing space because it was cool and it was fun, and we talked like space guys. We talked like geeks, and we thought it was cool. Now, I'm a geek, don't get me wrong. I am, and I'm proud to be a geek. I love to talk the technical stuff. I had a great time today talking technical information with a lot of the folks in various departments, and especially the engineers. But at my heart, that's not what I am. I'm an airman. I'm an airman at heart. Admiral Card is a sailor, Marine, soldier. That's what we are. But when we come together, we operate as a joint team. And the power that we create as a joint team is amazing. But a term was created a few years ago that I liked at first, and now it really bugs the heck out of me, and that was cross-domain operations. And the reason, and I talked to some of the cadets and midshipmen about this earlier, is that the reason that term bugs me now is that cross-domain meant, hey, go ask the space guy if he's got anything. Go ask the cyber guy if he's got anything. It wasn't, how are we going to fight and win and defeat this enemy using whatever we can? It was all about, oh, don't forget, ask the space guys. They might have something they can do here. It's similar to the story of how we built a joint force. You know, when I came in the service, it really wasn't a joint force. Goldwater Nichols was not that old. We were just starting to build joint commands. We were starting to embrace combatant commands across the world. We were just starting to look at how to do that, and we really did not fully embrace joint operations. And every time I went to an exercise or I went into a deployment, into a non-combat situation, I felt like either was educating people that were there on what space was supposed to do, or I was basically the guy that would sit in the vault and wait for somebody to ask him a question. I was not part of the team. But when I deployed in combat about a decade ago, and I walked into an environment where nobody really cared where the effect came from. All they cared was, there's an enemy here, how do I defeat that enemy? And I don't care what effect I create, if it comes from air, from land, from sea, from space, from cyber, I don't care where it comes from. As long as I can apply it in an integrated fashion, then it works. So joint, I think we've embraced that. Certainly we have in combat, although in the Pentagon sometimes I don't think we've fully embraced it. But in combat, I know we've embraced it. But we have not embraced multi-domain operations yet. And when we do embrace multi-domain operations, that's when the real power of the United States military is going to be applied. Because there's things we can do in space and cyber today that we're just starting to scratch the surface of. We can create effects on the ground from space, effects on the ground from cyber, effects in the air, effects at sea, all those kind of pieces from space and cyber. And oh, by the way, vice versa. Another frustrating question I get a lot is, as the commander of Air Force Space Command, if you're attacked in space, what are you going to do? I hate that question because it's not a space problem. People keep thinking that's a space problem, the space guy's got to figure out how to answer it. Goodness knows if something bad happens in space, there's something horrible happening here on the Earth. And if something horrible happened on the Earth, it's happening in some geographic element of the Earth, whether that's Central Command or European Command or Pacific Command. Something really bad is going on there. And so the first thing I'm going to do if something bad happens in space is I'm going to talk to the guy that's got something bad happening on the Earth and see what he's supposed to be doing about it. Because that's how the first place you're going to go to stop it. So there's no singular domain answer to a domain problem. It's all part of conflict on the Earth. And goodness knows, I never want to fight a war in space. A war in space is bad for the United States. It's bad for the world. It creates an environment, especially if it's kinetic, that will hurt our entire planet for generations to come. I can't even describe adequately the debris environment and the length of life of a debris environment in space. Because, so I'll tell the story, and it's not the best story, so I apologize to my Army brother here in the second row, but I use Gettysburg as an example, because Gettysburg is one of my favorite places to go in the world, because it makes me think, it makes me sad, it makes me proud to look across that battlefield today and imagine what it was like when Buford looked down Chambersburg Pike and saw Lee's army coming up that road. What would you do if you were sitting there? When Chamberlain came around the left and saw the men from Alabama coming up on the left flank of the Union Army, what would you do if you were there? And then to walk that hill the last day and to think of what Pickett's charge must have been like, the horror that was there, and then to imagine the horror of the battlefield on July the 4th. of 1863. Can you imagine how horrible that was on that day? But you go there today, and you look at it, and I think it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. Green grass, blue skies, beautiful trees. The earth healed itself, as the earth will heal itself. But if you have something bad happen in space, it's there. It's there for decades, centuries, many centuries, if it's high enough. If it's a geosynchronous orbit, 22,300 miles up, it may be there forever. Certainly forever for anybody in this room. And you can't do anything about it to fix it. The area that we're talking about is 73 trillion cubic miles. 73 trillion cubic miles. So when people talk about solutions to the debris problem in space, just try to move across 73 trillion cubic miles and figure out how to remove a piece of debris. That's not an engineering problem. That's an impossible problem. So we have to do everything we can to avoid that. But if we are challenged in space, we have to figure out how to fight through that, because space is critical to everything that we do. And cyberspace is the same way. So let's talk about space and cyberspace for a second. Go to space. Next chart, please. So traditionally, when we space guys would talk about the space terrain, we would talk about that top level. We would talk about weather satellites, GPS satellites, communication satellites, missile warning satellites, surveillance satellites. That's what we would talk about. And we would show these pictures of, here's the low Earth orbit, here's the medium Earth orbit where GPS is, here's the geosynchronous orbit, the magic orbit that operates right above the equator, so it looks like it's going the same speed as the Earth. That's how we get direct TV. That's the way we tell our story. But that is not the space terrain. The space terrain is that space segment plus the link, which is the RF linkage between a satellite and the ground, because if that linkage goes away, that satellite is worthless. Then there's the ground segment, the command and control element, the ground segment that's on the network segment that goes with that. If the ground segment goes away, that space segment is worthless. And then fundamentally, the piece that we should think about all the time, and the one that we somehow miss all the time, is the warfighter at the end of the spear, because that's who we're supporting. That's the reason we do all the rest of the stuff on that chart, is to get information to a singular warfighter, to a battalion, to a brigade, to a squadron, to a wing, to a fleet. That's why we do the mission that we do. But somehow, we just like to talk about the satellites. But if we're going to defend our space capabilities, we have to defend that entire terrain. We have to defend the linkages between all the terrain, because the most fragile elements of that terrain are actually not the space side. Everybody likes to talk about the ASAT threat against the space capabilities, but my biggest concern is everything below that on the chart. Because, oh, by the way, that's a whole lot easier to deny than the space segment. If you're operating 22,300 miles from the Earth and you have maneuver capability, you're inherently pretty hard to get after. If you're operating in a fairly low power RF link in a known frequency that, oh, by the way, we publish on the internet, that's a pretty easy thing to understand. So we have to be able to defend that entire element. Next chart. Cyberspace terrain. When you think about cyberspace terrain, what do you think about? Everybody thinks about beeps and squeaks, ones and zeros, the server farm on the left. That's what everybody thinks about. But that's not the cyber terrain. The cyber terrain is hooked into everything that we do. It's hooked into our SCADA systems. It's hooked into our base infrastructures. It's hooked into our airplanes. It's hooked into our satellites. It's hooked into our ships. It's hooked into our power systems. Everything that we do is linked with cyberspace, which means if we're going to defend cyberspace, it's the same story. Everybody likes to talk about defending our network. We can do everything we want about defending our network, and if we defend our network, we end up protecting our administrative services in the Department of Defense. That's what we end up defending. That's what we have to defend. It's over here on the right side of the chart, and we don't do that. We don't do that enough. We don't talk about that. That's a secondary issue. This is the primary issue in terms of focus today. That needs to be the primary issue, and we've got to get off of network defense and get on to capability defense. And oh, by the way, it's not defending every capability you see on that chart, but it's defending all the critical data that goes in there. So if an F-35 flies and it has a ground system that populates that F-35, whether that's on a ship or that's on the ground someplace, that data is secure and trustworthy, and it can be worked. It's the same every time we go up on a satellite and we publish data onto that satellite. We publish the location of that satellite on GPS. If we publish the wrong data, everything in the world starts falling apart. That's got to be secure. We have got to defend that side of the chart. So it's a very similar story to space. Space and cyberspace have to be defended. The entire terrain, not just the part that everybody thinks about when they talk about space or they talk about cyberspace, but the entire terrain. And if we don't defend that entire terrain, we as a nation are in deep trouble. So it's not about network defense. The other kick I'm on is I'm trying to get people to realize that there's no network in the world that you can build that is perfectly defensible. There's no way you can keep a determined adversary out of a network. They're going to figure out some way in it. They're going to figure out ways to hack, ways to come in sideways, ways to come in through back doors, ways to come in through insiders. There's some way that they're going to get into that capability. And if they do that, there's a couple things you have to know. Number one, you need to know that they're there, which means you have to watch for them. And you have to figure out ways to watch for them. And number two, it means you need to understand where your crown jewels are inside that network and protect the crown jewels. And the crown jewels for us is the data inside our networks. It's the information that we store inside our networks. And we can defend the crown jewels. We just can't defend all our networks. But we've been spending all our time talking about network defense as if a firewall is somehow going to protect us from nefarious activity. A firewall is good because it keeps out 99% of the problem, but that 1% is always going to get through, and you've got to figure out what to do with those because the damage could be done on either side of the house. So we have to think about everything from that terrain perspective. Next chart. And it all comes back to joint interoperability. So the interesting thing when I look at from a space perspective, that the pictures you see on the left are actually real things. Those are the user interfaces for all of our space capabilities that you see right there. Now, fortunately, they're all blurred, so you can't see the actual data that's on them, because that would be a problem. But nonetheless, you can tell just by looking at them that every one of them is different. Every satellite that we've built a unique ground system for that satellite, which means we pay for a unique ground system. That ground system has inherent cyber vulnerabilities that are different from every other ground system that we have. And we have to train our operators how to operate that unique ground system for every one we have. And oh, by the way, it's not just Air Force, it's Air Force, Navy, and Army on that chart. Why can't we just have a single user interface that's an attitude and velocity control subsystem on the right that is just the standard way? If you go into an airplane, every airplane cockpit's a little bit different. But you have an altimeter, you have certain meters that you know where they are. If you're a pilot and you're looking at a cockpit, you can figure out the basics of what that cockpit is. Doesn't matter where it is because it's going to operate the same place an airplane does. But if you're a space operator or you're a cyber operator and you come into your weapon system, whether that's GPS or whatever it is, and you look at the system, it's completely different every time. There's nothing in common, which means that not only do we have a tough time training our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marine on how to operate that, but we have inherent cyber vulnerabilities built into that because we create it every single time because we have no standard approach. So when I say you have to watch for the bad guys, if you're going to watch for the bad guys, you have to know where they're going to come in. And if you leave hundreds and hundreds of paths for them to come in, there's no way to watch them all the time. But if you have a standard approach, so in Space Command today, we're going to move off of unique systems for everything, and we'll move into an enterprise ground system. We're going to figure out how to operate from an enterprise perspective. We're going to figure out how to work with our joint partners and figure out how to have real joint multi-domain operational capability across the space and cyberspace domain. And it's going to be really hard, but we're going to have to do that because it is essential to the future of the United States that we figure out how to do that. Next. So that's what I have to say. The last thing I'll say today is really for the midshipmen and cadets here in the room. You know, I started off with a picture of President Kennedy in the middle of the screen. That was October of 1962. Where was President Kennedy in May of 1963? He was right here. He was right here at Vanderbilt University. And he gave an address, and the fundamental element of that address was we need participation. We need participants, not spectators. And those of you that have chosen to wear your nation's uniform have made a commitment. And that commitment is significant. Whether you realize it or not, when you raise your right hand and you become an ensign or a lieutenant, you've made a commitment to this country. And that commitment has a lot of things with it. It has risk of life, limb. It has risks associated with it. It has glory associated with it. It has the best friendships that you'll ever have in your life associated with it. But it only comes if you choose to participate. You don't get any of that by being a spectator. And for the broader audience in this room, I can't tell you how important it is. This nation right now faces threats around the world. A resurgent Russia, a challenge from ISIL, a challenge from the Taliban again in Afghanistan, a challenge in Africa, a challenge in the Pacific. We face challenges in so many ways, and if our nation just has people that watch and don't do anything, we're in trouble. So we need participants. We need people that will participate. We need people that will sign up to serve their nation in their nation's uniform. We need people that choose to participate in the political process. We need people that choose to participate in their communities. We need people that will speak up and talk about the challenges that we have in the future. We need an academic environment where people can say and speak different things without fear of retribution. We need to be able to do what basically our nation requires of us and our nation put in our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. That's what's there. But it only works if we participate. It doesn't work if we just sit and watch. So I ask you in particular, every one of you that are wearing your nation's uniform. Some of you have only been wearing it for a few months. But the day you put that on, you made a commitment. However long you serve, whether you come on active duty or not, you've made a commitment. So I ask you to follow through and participate. Thank you very much, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to see General Hyten and the Secretary of the Air Force on 60 Minutes over the last, I guess that was about 2 months ago now, maybe 3. But I tell you, it was one of the best and most best orchestrated 60 Minutes that I've seen, where General Hyten walked the thin line between telling the adversaries that we're deadly serious and at the same time ensuring the world of the balance between offensive and defensive capabilities in space, and that, well, I'll let him talk about that some more, but it was a fantastic thing, and you're even more privileged today to have him live and in person here today, and we're very honored to have you here, sir. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
First question. If you don't have one, I definitely have one. Yes, sir.
So you talked about combining all the user interfaces into one thing and basically standardizing the code. Will that open up the defense system to basically a shared vulnerability, or will there be steps to deal with that?
So that's a really good question. So let me describe a another thing that we've done on the cyber side in the Air Force that'll make it real instead of just generic. Because I could give you a big generic picture that would sound really good, but you wouldn't understand how it is implemented. So let me talk about how it's implemented. So 5 years ago, the United States Air Force had well over, it had thousands of networks. It had 116 gateways into our networks, and we couldn't tell who was doing what to who. There was no way we could watch that, and so basically we were hugely vulnerable. Today we're still vulnerable, but we have 16 gateways in a single network. So when you have 16 gateways in a single network, you can watch those gateways, and you also have visibility from the very top of the system all the way down to a single desktop. You have visibility of what happens. So you can create ways by looking for abnormal behavior that you can watch for things that shouldn't be there. If you don't have that kind of structure, you can't watch your network. And if you can't watch your network, you have vulnerabilities, you don't know where they are. So we still have vulnerabilities, but we know where they are and we can watch them. It doesn't mean that we're unhackable, but it goes back to what I talked about. There's no network that is unhackable. All you can do is create a defensive structure that allows as much defense on the network as you can, and then you have to protect what's really important. And so I would prefer to go down the path I just described. Then I can define what's really important and defend that. Right now we're trying to defend everything. And when you're trying to defend everything and it's all dispersed all over the place, it's a very difficult problem. I hope that answers your question.
A lot of your talk was about vulnerabilities and interconnectivity, and it's kind of fascinating. Thank you. My question was specifically about the threat. It seems to me the threat should drive everything that we're doing. And you mentioned some threats, some immediate threats right now that are occurring in the world, throughout the world. But in your domain, what are the biggest threats that you're living with? And can you share a little bit where they're coming from, particular countries, if you would?
Well, I can only go into so much in an unclassified environment. But China and Russia both have significant counter space capabilities that they have not only built, but they've publicly talked about. In some cases, especially with China, they publicly tested those capabilities. Why do you think they've done that? They've done that as part of number one, to develop the capability, but also as part of a strategic message to the United States that says, these capabilities that you've gathered in space over the years, you won't be able to take advantage of those in the future conflict. Our job is to make sure that that's not true, and we have to work in order to do that. There's also, if you look at that space terrain chart, if you imagine that space terrain chart in your mind, it's a lot more than just the satellites that are up there. China and Russia talk about threatening our satellites, but there's a lot more people in the world that can threaten the rest of the enterprise. For example, if you're in Europe, you could go onto the internet and buy a GPS jammer for 15 euro, approximately. You can't buy that in the United States because it's illegal, but across many parts of the world, you can go buy that for nothing. And you can plug it in the cigarette light of your car and create a GPS jamming environment around your car, your house, etc. Doesn't sound so bad until you think about criminal behavior, until you think about adversary behavior that might want to do that, and you think about upping the power into that and how difficult it is to find that. That's a big problem. You think about the links that we have with all our communication satellites. All those links are known frequencies in the RF spectrum that we apply for, maintain, etc. Every one of those, if you have an operational dish on the ground, communicate with the satellite, you configure it a different way, it's a jammer. And you can take those links out. So people in the press talk a lot about China and Russia, and they're being the most visible in terms of trying to create threats in the space side. But there are a number of other things to be concerned about. On the cyber side, it's everybody. Because the price of access for space is still very expensive. The price for access in cyberspace is a laptop and an internet connection. Pretty much anybody can go into that. Now there's different levels of skill, there's different levels of involvement, there's different levels of things you have to worry about, but the cyber side is across across the entire planet, everywhere. It's a much simpler threat problem, which means it's more across the planet. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
When all the technology is taken into consideration, the linchpin is still going to come down to one thing, and I'd like for you to address this. It's the commitment from the commander-in-chief down to use rules of engagement that will take out the enemy and to even want to take out the enemy at whatever level. So how do you feel in the big picture, not just this administration, but past administrations and going forward, will we use the proper rules of engagement to use all this wonderful stuff to accomplish the end, defeat the enemy?
So when you started your question, I thought you were going in a different direction. So I'm going to come back to your specific question, but because it's related. Because the direction I thought you were going is the most important element of our space capabilities is our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. That's the most important element. All of this magic stuff that we have, all of the GPS, the GPS constellation today is flown by 7 airmen at Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado, average age 23 years old. The crew commander today, let's see, what shift is it? So the crew commander today is 27. That's very old for a GPS crew commander. But the 2 Zoo satellite system operators today are 19 that operate the entire GPS constellation for the world today. That's an amazing thing when you think about it. What other nation in the world could possibly do that? The strength of our military are our people that choose to serve. But for those people to choose to serve, they need to have clear rules of engagement. And today, for those GPS operators, I cannot tell them what their rules of engagement are. I can give them broad guidance. I can tell them my commander's intent, and I've done that. I write down my commander's intent in writing so they understand what they are. But I'm doing it without specific rules of engagement, because the rules of engagement are not defined, because we have not defined norms of behavior in the international community in order to translate those into rules of engagement. There was a European Code of Conduct that was proposed. There was 2 really bad things in the European Code of Conduct. There was no right of self-defense, which anything that we sign up to as a nation should always have the right of self-defense, and it would prohibit missile defenses, which I don't know why you would prohibit yourself from defending yourself against a threat. But the good thing about that code of conduct was it tried to put down on paper what norms of behavior would be. Because of those 2 huge holes, our nation decided not to pursue that. And I wouldn't want any kind of norms of behavior that limited me that way, but nonetheless, we need to walk down that path and define what those norms are, because without them, I can't translate it into rules of engagement for the people that are going to operate in a threat environment. The same is true in cyber. Cyberspace is not the Wild West anymore. There are rules for how you operate in cyberspace, but we're still arguing through it. And you saw, I think the Senate yesterday agreed to vote. I don't think they passed it. They may have passed it today. The first legislation on cyberspace, I'll call them rules, norms. That's a huge step forward. I hope that the House takes it, they agree on it, goes to the President, they sign it, because I'm at the point now as a commander where I need some rules in those domains. And it's a political decision what they are, and I'm not going to get into the political discussion. I'll give my best military advice to anybody that asks, and Congress has, and the White House has, but it's ultimately a political decision. But we desperately need those kind of rules of engagement to allow that 7-person crew, if they came into a threat environment, to know exactly what to do. So thanks for that question, for a couple of reasons. Thank you.
One more, Scott? Okay, one more question.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Midshipman First Class Ramirez. Sir, in your presentation, you mentioned information superiority. In our naval science classes, we talk a lot about naval superiority and how we establish it with our forward presence and deterrence. Is there an analogous type of scenario in cyberspace? And if so, what does that look like?
So it's in space and cyberspace, interestingly enough, because it goes back to how I defined information in the beginning. So when I defined information, I defined the two domains. The point I was making is fundamentally you have to decide how to obtain information superiority in those domains. I don't particularly like the term space superiority or cyber superiority. So you didn't hear me use those in the remarks because it creates the wrong impression of what we're trying to do. But we do need to create information superiority in both those domains, and those domains link to every other domain we operate in, including naval. And so in order to do that, you have to basically establish a mix of offensive and defensive capabilities. The Navy talks about forward presence in their doctrine. The Air Force talks about a number of different ways to gain and maintain air superiority. The Army has the same thing. It's the same in the space and cyberspace domains. And so we have to define, and that's why rules of engagement are so important, because without rules of engagements, we're just kind of making it up. One of the amazing things that the Navy has is you have the law of the sea. You have the law of the sea that defines what international, and it's critically important now in the Western Pacific that those international norms define what you mean by how you can have forward presence and what forward presence means and how far you can go into that. But on the space and cyberspace side, we don't have those laws of space and laws of cyberspace that define where we can go. Therefore, it becomes very difficult for us to figure out how to establish that presence and where we need to be. So that's what we have to go into next as we talk about space and cyberspace. But the way I'll summarize the answer to your question, and it's a really good question, is that we have to think about it just as any other operational domain in the military. When we think about it like we think about land, maritime, and air, we think about space and cyberspace in the same operational way. It's really not that hard. When somehow we think of it as special and different and fundamentally, unique, then it's very, very difficult to understand. But when you make it a military problem, it's not that hard to figure out. All right.
Over to you, Captain Crabtree.
Thank you, General. I know we've just barely scratched the surface, but I hope that for many of you this has made you think about a topic which is really we're barely getting into, but it's going to be so important for us, and especially for our cadets and midshipmen. This is going to be something that they're going to have to evolve into, no matter what career field they choose, and as you spoke about earlier. But it's been our honor, sir, to have you this afternoon, both to show you the campus and to have you speak to us here. And we have our Midshipman Battalion Commander, Midshipman Halpern, has a small token of appreciation for you spending time with us today, sir.
That's a great picture. Thank you. Thank you again. Well done.
And for all of you, thank you so much again for joining us. And I hope that this will continue our 7th year, our 8th year next year. We will engage in another wonderful subject like this. We have a small reception in the back of the auditorium. I hope you can join us for a few minutes. Thank you again.